I'm Jeff Asher, and this is the Jeff-alytics podcast. Public conversations about crime tend to fixate on big numbers and simple narratives about crime being either up or down. Today's guest, Susan Parker, approaches crime through a different lens, one grounded in quantitative social science, public health, and the deeper stories inside crime data. Susan has an immense knowledge of how agencies take data and turn it into statistics through the FBI's NIBRS, the National Incident-Based Reporting System. Instead of just counting crime, she studies how data is created, where it breaks down, and what it reveals about gun violence, non-fatal shootings, and the policies meant to prevent them. In this episode, we talk about the multi-step process behind crime reporting, the challenges agencies face adopting NIBRS, and why timeliness and accuracy matters. Here's my conversation with Susan Parker on NIBRS and telling a fuller, more accurate story about crime in America.
Hi, Jeff. Nice to be here.
So let's dive right in. Susan, how do you describe what you do?
I describe it as quantitative social science at the intersection of health and crime, which typically means focusing on these large crime databases or medical records databases that have multiple entries to record a single event and some commonplace complexities that are endlessly either interesting or complex depending on your take.
So would you say that your expertise in sort of NIBRS and crime statistics has sort of stemmed from necessity?
Yes. I think my interest and kind of work in NIBRS really started just by virtue of being a gun violence researcher. And it's so hard to get high quality data that measures even how many people are shot in a year. That I ended up spending lots of time focusing on health records to try to understand if we can measure gun violence effectively there. And I started thinking a lot about crime data, especially NIBRS, to think about, well, okay, if the medical records are flawed for various reasons, what can the crime records tell us? And does that help us measure gun violence in particular? It just ended up that these are just such fascinating problems that I think violence measurement writ large is something I focused on both in these crime records and in the health records. But really for NIBRS, I feel like once I started digging a little bit, I kind of just kept going, and it has so many uses and so many complexities that it is really interesting. And I still spend a lot of time with NIBRS.
So let's take a couple of steps back and sort of start at the beginning. For our lay listeners, what is NIBRS and sort of why is it so important and so germane to this conversation?
That is a great question. So NIBRS is a new reporting system that's actually pretty old. I think in the 80s, the national academies and the Bureau of Justice Statistics and so federal statistical agencies looked at our crime reporting system. The previous one was the Uniform Crime Reporting System's summary reporting system, and it came about in the 20s. It's measured the same stuff since the 20s. I think a group of police chiefs actually got together and was like, hey, here's how we're going to count crime. It's going to be counts of monthly events, and that's what we're going to count, and that's how we're going to count it. So we're just going to count how many robberies, we're just going to count how many assaults happen in our jurisdictions, and we'll record crime that way. There are a number of problems with that which NIBRS sought to fix. Some of that is counting more types of crimes. Some of that is especially in the incident level measures, which is, not just counting that a robbery happened, but counting how many robbery incidents and what are the attributes of it. And so NIBRS came about in the 80s to fix some of these problems with the older, less sophisticated crime reporting system, that summary reporting system. But its adoption was really, really slow, partially because it was never mandated. No one has to report crime. There are some states that have crime reporting mandates, but for the most part, you don't have to report data. Agencies choose to report data to the FBI. And so trying to get a replacement for this old system in place, which is this new system, NIBRS, was just really slow going for a number of years until it became the nation's crime reporting system in 2021, the FBI decided. So anyway, that was a long and tangential way of saying NIBRS is the new system. It's been in place for a long time, but adoption has been super slow up until 2021 when that really sped up and became the nation's crime reporting system.
Okay, so we're going to, again, sort of start at that basic level. That's, I think, great description. If if my car is broken into or I'm robbed or whatever, how does that victimization of me turn into a statistic as it's reported by the FBI?
Yeah. So the way a car break-in becomes a crime statistic is that someone has to report it to police. That person can be the person whose car it was, that person can be a neighbor, but basically someone has to let police know, law enforcement agencies know that that crime happened. So that's that kind of reporting pathway. People talk about that a lot. There's a lot of focus on whether we get all of the crimes, whether we don't. There are some ways to think about that, but after that crime is reported, an agency takes an incident. In NIBRS, that's a crime incident. I think if it's a car break-in, that's a property crime, so it's a crime against society, I think, and not a person. But anyway, that's a separate... That was very tangential. We didn't need to go there. But basically, once that car break-in is reported to police, police take an incident report. If police take an incident report, they're going to record what happened, the date, the time, and if it happens down the line, whether there's an arrest associated with that incident. If they find the person who broke into the car and, say, stole a gun or stole a radio or whatever, the crime report becomes a statistic once it's reported to police, once police take that incident, once police then record that incident in their reporting system, which gets translated into NIBRS, which gets translated up to the state uniform crime reporting program, who actually tells the FBI that the crime happened. And then, so that's like this sort of 6-stage process of who tells whom. It's sort of a telephone chain, I guess. But essentially, that's how crime reporting happens. It's pretty removed from the actual report, but agencies pretty faithfully report their crime to the uniform crime reporting systems in their states, who then report to the FBI, who then release the data to the public about 9 months after the year has passed.
And the NIBRS reporting, in contrast to the old system, is incident-based, right? So, like, rather than just the aggregated numbers, you can dig in and really get a lot of more details. Is that correct?
Absolutely. There's a lot more detail in NIBRS. It's so much detail that it's been hard for agencies, I think, in some cases, to report to this, because you're not just recording, hey, this car break-in or this robbery happened. You're reporting perpetrator information. You're reporting whether an arrest happened that's associated with the event. You're reporting how much you think the gun that was in the car that was stolen was worth. So you're reporting on all of these different segments of information that NIBRS collects, which are not just about the incident. They're about, property, the offenses, the suspects, the arrestees. It's a whole kind of reporting ecosystem, but it makes it really, which is really rich for people who are trying to use that data and understand crime, but I think really challenging for some of the law enforcement agencies to have to report in this standardized fashion.
And you bring up sort of the level of detail, and you having used this data. Can you walk me through some of the ways that you've used it? I mean, I know you've done a ton of research using NIBRS data. What's been the most effective, interesting, innovative means of using this that you used?
Yeah, I think the most recent thing I've done with NIBRS that is pretty interesting. I think others may not think so, but I think, NIBRS records information about stolen guns, and the Council of Criminal Justice commissioned a report from Deb Azriel, who's at the Harvard Injury Control Center, and myself about, how many stolen guns are there and what are the circumstances? Because NIBRS has so much information about every incident. We could look at, was a stolen gun in a rural setting? Was it in an urban setting? Was it stolen from a car? Was it stolen from a different location? Was the car parked at a bar? Was it what time of day, what season? And so, some of the same limitations of crime data still exist. So say someone has their gun stolen, doesn't really notice it for 2 days afterward, there's still going to be that noise from imperfect reporting of an event that happens. But the level of detail is so much higher that we were able to find that, hey, guns are really stolen from cars. And in some places like Tennessee, this is increasing really substantially in the last years of reporting that we have. So there's interesting things that you can do with the granularity of NIBRS that just we had no sense and no ability to do previously.
Can I ask, so when you did this research, what did you find as far as guns being stolen?
Yeah, so for the last, this is part of a bigger trend. Burglary has been decreasing over time, but in particular with stolen guns, stolen guns are not stolen from homes. Part of that might be during COVID, people were home more, but a lot of what we're seeing is that guns are stolen from cars. That rate increased something like 33% in the most urban areas over the last say 5 years. And in some jurisdictions, it's been really substantial. Milwaukee has had a huge spike. Memphis has had a huge spike. And it's tricky to say like what's causing that, but even knowing like, hey, like guns stored in cars are a really big source to the illicit gun market is something that we didn't really have data to answer previously.
And can you walk me through, most people probably don't know this, but the plan is for NIBRS to be able to collect non-fatal shooting data, correct?
Yes.
So
and
how would that work?
so, this is really huge in a lot of ways. Non-fatal shooting data affects more people than fatal shootings, obviously. That like the rate is something like 5-1, and we just really haven't had good data on it. Law enforcement knows about shootings, but there just hasn't been a way for them to report it. In the old system, the way it was reported was that it's an aggravated assault with a firearm. And so it could have been that you were maybe pistol whipped during a robbery. Like it wasn't a precise measure of how many people were non-fatally shot in the US. And so what's happened with NIBRS is that the same crime codes existed, right? Like it was an aggravated assault. And the same kind of concept of this happened, this vague concept of this happened with a gun. So we didn't really know what happened, was how NIBRS was initially set up. But there's a process to amend like NIBRS and change things. It's run through the CJIS Advisory Policy Board. The fact that this exists even is the UCR program has existed in this way for many years. But anyway, so the way that you can edit, or the way there's a process by which agencies, the public, researchers can actually propose edits to crime data. It runs through the FBI's Criminal Justice Information Services Advisory Policy Board. This board, reviews and approves proposed changes. One of the proposed changes was with gunshot wound, with aggravated assaults with a gun, to just add a field that said this person had a gunshot wound and that the gun was discharged. And so with those two fields being added, we know how many people were shot at, but maybe the perpetrator missed. And we also can tell if the gun was fired and the individual was shot. And that kind of granularity in gun data has just not existed at all. So that's really exciting. It was approved, but then now we're to the part where you have to implement the approved change. And to my knowledge, it has not yet been released in the FBI's technical specifications, which means even if states are tracking this now, like some states are, Virginia is like, yeah, we're ready to go. We have this data. We track this. We're already set up to measure non-fatal shootings. Other states may not be. And so even if Virginia's ready, if it's not in the technical specifications, they can't submit this data that they're already gathering. And for other states who don't already gather this information, there's a whole setup of training officers to gather this information, of figuring out how you can enter this into your crime reporting system if you're a local agency, maybe paying to get that added into your RMS if you're a local agency and you don't control your database, which many do not. It is going to be a whole process. And so it's not clear when it would even be feasible for this to happen. To my knowledge, I'm not sure of the rollout period of any other changes. Non-fatal firearm injuries, one change that we're particularly excited about, but there are other changes to NIBRS. For instance, geocoding for every crime. That's been proposed and accepted. Agencies gather it. It's just not clear how long the training, what the process will look like for that to be actually national in scope.
Would that add kind of, in theory, tremendous privacy concerns as well? Because there's no PII or anything in their private information. Doesn't that sort of, if you're adding in lat longs or other coordinates, doesn't that open up a whole different can?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know a lot of agencies will jitter the lat long a little bit when they post it to their sites, but typically like non-identified crime information is publicly posted with geocoded information all the time. And maybe there is a broader privacy concern with that writ large, but I don't think that agencies currently are prohibited from doing that or from reporting that. Whether there could be problems with that, I think I would have to think maybe a bit more about like is it, if you are reporting a crime, is that and we don't have your identity or anything like that, like is that it's there's personal information, it's not disclosed, like I'm not sure. I would have to think more about that.
Yeah. And I know a lot of the agencies that we deal with are, even when they post the data, especially for either crimes committed or are victimized where the victim is a juvenile, or like a lot of sex offenses, they'll either completely leave out the address or leave out the coordinates. So it's something, like you said, a lot of agencies are already doing. I agree. I don't know the answer. I'm curious about that. Uh, if you were to speculate on this, getting back to sort of the non-fatal shooting data, do you think that this is something that agencies are going to struggle with a lot? Not New York City or Cincinnati or Philadelphia, that they've already got the shooting data and it's easy for them. Do you think agencies that aren't doing this are going to really struggle, or is this something that they'll be wholeheartedly embracing and able to take up that challenge easily?
I think it's a good question. I think if I had to guess, it would look a lot like NIBRS adoption, honestly. There probably are some agencies that seem like it should be easy, but there's an unexpected fee that could send things back. So that was kind of why I think potentially some of the larger agencies weren't adopting NIBRS quickly. Like, they had the data, they had the fields. It was a matter of tweaking RMSs with no funding to do it, but funding is required. And so I think like it could be a little bit more idiosyncratic around large agencies versus small agencies, like we saw with NIBRS, which is that some agencies were just a lot, like for instance, Chicago Police, I think, didn't report to NIBRS until 2021, but they absolutely post data, daily to their crime reporting system. So it's not like they lack the technical expertise to do near real-time reporting. Are these other barriers that are unique to NIBRS. And so I think you're right, though. For the most part, I think it'll probably be these agencies that are not the large agencies. One of the barriers that's been discussed in the past, Major City Police is a policing association, and they used to actually post non-fatal shooting data way before even NIBRS. So like 2018, 19, 20, they had kind of quarterly reporting of non-fatal shootings from the largest police agencies in the U.S. And so large police agencies track this information. But one of the things that they said was that it was really hard to think about comparing these because they all had different definitions of what a non-fatal shooting is. I think the NIBRS definition helps to clarify that, hey, this is about a gun discharge and whether or not this is potentially like at a person such that we can record their injury or not. But I think some agencies were taking shootings at, buildings or things like that and recording them as non-fatal shootings. And so there's a bit of a definitional thing that I think the NIBRS definition will sort of help to corral, but there's also, for agencies that are not recording this at all, there is officer training. I think when you talked to a bunch of UCR, I talked to a bunch of state UCR programs when they were rolling out NIBRS. Who would do that? I was doing that. So when the state UCR program coordinators, who are basically responsible for gathering NIBRS data in their states, when they were talking about some of the barriers, and this is, just interviews and talking to them, so nothing super like scientific, but they mentioned officer training as a really big issue as they were rolling out NIBRS. Like, officers had to record new fields they hadn't recorded previously, and this just takes time. It takes buy-in from the agency, it takes coordination, and it's just a slow process.
And I'm not going to put you on the spot to call out any states that are doing a bad job with NIBRS, but I know you've talked to just a ton of them, and you probably know more about sort of the national scope of states reporting outside of anybody that doesn't work for the FBI. What states are kind of doing a good job with the NIBRS transition, and are there any commonalities amongst them that sort of make this something that the states that are sort of struggling? I know I'm in Louisiana. I'll say Louisiana's struggling. What are the commonalities that the states that are maybe a little bit behind could take advantage of to catch up?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think sometimes these programs are so idiosyncratic and idiosyncratically staffed that certainly staffing and resources has to play a part in it. I remember submitting just a records request from a large state that wasn't reporting very much, just to see hey, how many people does your UCR program have? I was trying to get a sense of whether that really mattered. And, it's not causal or anything, but this large state they sent me back a response to my FOIA that says, yes, we have one guy, his salary is this much. He is given a computer. This computer is worth this much. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is your entire UCR reporting program. This outcome makes perfect sense to me. So staffing and resources play a role in that. I will say that the state UCR programs are super I think they talk a lot. They have a coordinating group of state UCRs. They meet, they share strategies. And some of the strategies they shared for trying to get this off the ground were, can we pool resources? There are small agencies, they all have the same problem of not being able to report data. What can we do to help them? So one state agency was taking their state police's infrastructure to write tickets, and they were adapting that to let small agencies report to NIBRS. And so super creative situations with zero budget was kind of the theme of some states that I felt like, wow, you guys are doing really well, but I wouldn't have thought you'd be super well funded. And I think, I'm trying to think of other conversations that were really striking, but the kind of theme of how do we pool resources in our state to get a better outcome also extended to some of the vendor negotiations. There was something I think, 4 or 5 major police RMS vendors. And a lot of times these contracts mean that you have to pay for every change. This is a separate example, but I remember talking to a police captain about ShotSpotter once and why don't you guys have ShotSpotter data that you can look at? What's going on with that?
So they had ShotSpotter, they just didn't have the data?
Yes, their jurisdiction was paying hundreds of thousands of dollars annually for ShotSpotter, but that police analyst could not analyze the ShotSpotter data because the jurisdiction couldn't come up with the extra $14,000 to get it put into the RMS, such that this analyst could analyze it, right? It's these barriers that are so seemingly small from the outside, but really real if you're in a jurisdiction, looking for an extra $14,000 lying around, they become really significant. And so I think the UCR agencies were trying to say, hey, can we pool two agencies that need to negotiate with Mark 49? Can we help them negotiate better? What can we do internally? But I think the vendor negotiations around adopting new things is going to be an ongoing thing that will kind of continue to impact any NIBRS change, improvement, et cetera, going forward.
Speaking of going forward, what's the future of NIBRS look like?
I think the future of NIBRS looks, in some ways really good. For a while, once the initial 2021 adoption happened, and I think, folks like you, the Marshall Project, there was a lot of really good attention around how poorly, in some ways, the transition was going. The former reporting program, the summary reporting program, typically had 95% of the U.S. population covered. The first year of NIBRS adoption, I think it went down to something like 59 to 61%. It was just such a wild drop in what we knew about crime data and at a really critical time. Every year feels critical to know information about crime data, but this was a particularly critical year. But, I've been pleasantly surprised that participation has risen. I think the last year of coverage was something like 91% or 94%, I forget, but it was really good. And I think agencies have really pulled together to submit data to NIBRS in a way that I would have thought would be really challenging. This is a really challenging system. There wasn't a lot of funding for it. Some of the ways that the funding was given out were through grants like the NCSX program that was giving federal resources to kind of help agencies adopt NIBRS, but these grants programs go to agencies that can write a grant to get into the grants program, and that just selects for a certain kind of agency that probably was going to do okay anyway. So it was really hard to get resources to those departments who were potentially the most unlikely to report. And so it's been surprising that this reporting increase has been, to me at least, it's been surprising that it's been so swift to rise back up to this pretty good nationwide coverage. But things that aren't going well, of course, are that we don't see anything from NIBRS until, 9 months post the year-end close. It's really hard to have timely information, which is why, certainly, the real-time crime tracker that you have, and I think NORC has an effort, right? These efforts to try to understand what's happening now in any kind of way have been so critical because we don't have any clue. I think the 2024 data was maybe released a few weeks ago. We just don't have timely information.
Yeah, and released in August, and that was early. That was the earliest in years, which is actually which I take as a sign that they're getting better at releasing these sort of estimates. They have, I'll step on the FBI defense here on this, that they are reporting the monthly data, but because of this lack of standardization that you talk about, it's so hit or miss. You get states that do really good. And it's basically, this is the data through the most recent completed month. And then you get states where it's like, there's no agencies that are reporting here and you can't do anything with this. And so that's been interesting to see. So, all right, we're gonna leave the known here, and I think get more into the speculation, because I want to talk about the kind of theme of the podcast. The basic idea is people don't believe crime trends, and the podcast happens to be starting at a time when crime is going down, and yet all of the data shows that it's going up. And I'll be the first person to say when it starts to go up nationally, but in general, everything is pointing down. And so, are there ways to use kind of this new system, this new data coming out from NIBRS to change those perceptions? And do you see opportunities as someone that does like really deep-seated research to kind of change what people think about crime using these new systems? Does that factor into any of your work?
I will say that I'm a very cut and dry, applied micro-ish person. And so I don't deal as much in perception around that. I guess I can talk a bit about my work on permitless carry, which I think is often a bit about what we perceive about firearms. But yeah, I think from your point that everything is trending downward and yet we perceive this differently, I think that's so real, and I hope that other smarter researchers can figure out ways to think about that. One thing that I do find to be a bit frustrating about the conversation around like crime trending upward or downward is that we always turn to the National Victimization Report. And like, I think we do this every year where we say that, okay, only like 60% of crimes are reported to police. And so I think that has this narrative that this longitudinal kind of NIBRS type data can be less useful, but I think we do this every year. It's a household sample, and so many crime victims are just like not adequately counted in that, and they're most likely to be victims of violence that, like, in particular, like I think the sense that like reporting to police is too low, and therefore we're missing this big picture. I think with violence, that's a much less likely thing. There's work from the 80s that Phil Cook showed that like something like a third of gunshot wounds are ever captured. And so it's tangential, it's off topic, but I think part of this perception is that, people aren't going to police, et cetera. And I think like the NCBS estimates always play into that in a way that I think undervalues some of our violent crime reporting. So anyway, I think I'm saying that I'm not the best person to answer that question.
No, you're a great person to answer that question. I appreciate that. No, and to your point exactly, that whenever I write about it, I'll say, we have murders going down, and they're like, well, you can't trust the FBI data. Okay, here's the CDC data. Here's the gun violence type data. Here's individual agencies we're getting it from that are reporting it. So I appreciate the breadth of sources that we have now that hopefully can tell consistent stories.
Right. But maybe let's just not count NCBS with regard to violence. Let's count those other ones.
Well, yeah, and CVS is it's a survey. It doesn't count murders, so definitely. And I've talked about how some of the issues I think within CVS, as far as like people like to use it as violence was up, or property crime was up 8%. It's like, well, no, it's a survey. It has a wide margin of error. It's not counting exactly apples to apples. So I'm going to have to invite some of my BGS friends on now to offer a counter to this discussion. So they could all stop listening a few minutes ago. So I guess taking that, and I don't know that you're going to love this question either. We were talking about this before we started recording. How do people like you and I make this interesting so that people want to listen, people want to read, people want to take that information and use it in arguments around the Thanksgiving table, or use it when they're just contextualizing what they see on the news?
I mean, I think part of what is so valuable about what you're doing is you're making it timely. Who cares about what happened 2 years ago? It doesn't really help anyone answer any questions, right? So timeliness is a huge thing. If you're just able to kind of not even have data such that you could refute, my uncle saying that carjackings are on the rise and that Chicago is burning down, which is over my Thanksgiving dinner table typically. Even having data in hand to say anything about that. And I am always the crime person at these family holiday events. It's terrible. Like, I don't want to be that person.
The feeling.
I get all, yeah. Do you get all? I get all the crazy uncles. Do you?
Well, Well, no, it's crazy family members. I don't think we have any crazy uncles per se, but yeah, I get all of the questions and all of the questions about whatever city is in the news most recently. And it's like, well, let me bring up all of the data that I've been collecting on this city and have a detailed conversation while I want to drink wine and watch football.
Yeah, yeah. Those are competing interests. I have three like very large Sicilian uncles who all follow crime closely, but from a variety of sources. I'm blanking completely on the question. I got distracted by things.
How do we make this interesting? How do you effectively talk to people about this?
I said a bit about timeliness. I think also like what people care about sometimes is kind of about policy, and I don't know. I think that when it's policies people care about and there's actually accessible research that they believe, then that can sometimes help. Though, I mean, to be clear, research, right, is so delayed, just like the crime data, and it may not, I think, come out in these ways that are super accessible. I think with some of my work on permitless carry, trying to find ways to make that accessible to people, I think it's super timely.
You keep mentioning it. We didn't mention so what did you find in this?
Well, I used NIBRS, and I found that basically after permitless carry, in like the very months even before aggravated assaults, violent crime starts to tick up, and it totals an increase of about 11% in just the months after a permitless carry law is passed. And I feel like that might be so. I think like the way that you show people that matters. I mean, and to be clear, there are those who this will never, like, this is not going to matter. But I think like some of the evidence that NIBRS lets you show convincingly is a really granular change. And I think sometimes we do these policy analyses and we're like, yes, 5 years after this law has taken effect, we could see a change. But NIBRS lets you show things really granularly. And I think that there's value in that for helping people to believe that this is actually about permitless carry and not about the fact that maybe people bought guns afterwards, or they, carried them more afterwards. Certainly these things are contributing, but being able to show a clear change right around a policy change, I think is something NIBRS can do well. There's another project I'm working on with school shootings, trying to look at like youth firearm behaviors right around the school shooting to try to see like, hey, are youth carrying guns a bit more? Are they getting into gun assaults? Are they victimized by gun assaults more often? How does that work with these just really tragic events, and how can we think about reducing victimization afterward? And we really couldn't do some of this research without super granular data from NIBRS. I mean, some of it is available at the agency level, but I mean, you need credible comparisons. And for that, there's not much to replace the value of just a really good national database like NIBRS. So, it's a very wonky answer to that, but to the extent that we can use data to really be credible and clear about our methods and be credible about how quickly the policy, you're making it as clear as possible in terms of this is driving this, and it's really hard to refute that this is happening like a week after the policy. That's, I think, pretty helpful potentially in changing, or at least in providing information to those who are interested in receiving it.
That's great. This has been fascinating. I love this conversation. I think other people will. I hope other people will, and hopefully it makes it seem more accessible to others. Susan, thank you so much for joining the program.
Thanks. Always a pleasure to talk about crime data.
Thanks for listening to the Jeff-alytics podcast. Be sure to subscribe, and to learn more, head on over to ahdatalytics.com for more information and previous episodes. If you like what you heard, please leave a glowing review, which will help others to discover the show. Until next time, I'm Jeff Asher.